$7.8 trillion. That is the total amount of new national debt added during just one presidential term, specifically Donald Trump's 4 years in office, from January 2017 to January 2021. Translated to an individual scale, that works out to approximately $23,500 in new federal debt for every person in America. This video is a forensic accounting exercise. We are tracking the money, not the politics. Our goal is to see where the dollars went, who authorized them, and what the return was. A $7.8 trillion shift in the public ledger requires a full audit. To understand how we got here, we have to follow the trail from day one. On January 20, 2017, the gross national debt stood at $19.95 trillion. That was the starting line. At that time, the Congressional Budget Office projected the debt would naturally grow by roughly $3 trillion over the next 4 years. This was the expected baseline for existing programs and interest obligations. The administration inherited an economy with falling unemployment and 7 consecutive years of GDP growth. Despite a campaign promise to eliminate the national debt within 8 years, the final balance sheet on January 20, 2021 showed a total debt of $27.75 trillion. Subtracting the $3 trillion baseline projection from that $7.8 trillion increase leaves a $4.8 trillion difference. We are going to find out exactly what filled that gap. The first major policy shift was a decision to reduce federal revenue through the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The law's central provision was a permanent reduction of the corporate tax rate, which dropped from 35% to 21%. It also lowered individual income tax rates across most brackets, though unlike the corporate cuts, these were scheduled to expire after 2025. For families, the law doubled the standard deduction and increased the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. This overhaul fundamentally shifted the government's fiscal strategy by leaning on individual and corporate tax reductions as a primary tool for economic policy. The administration argued these cuts would pay for themselves. The theory was that lower taxes would trigger enough new investment and growth to generate more tax revenue than the government was giving up. However, nonpartisan estimates from the Joint Committee on Taxation projected a different outcome: a $1.5 to $1.9 trillion increase in the deficit over 10 years. The immediate data supported those projections. In the first year after the law took effect, federal corporate tax receipts dropped from $409 billion to $269 billion, a 34% decline in revenue. Analysis by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget later confirmed the cuts did not generate enough growth to offset the lost revenue. By prioritizing the theory of self-financing over current revenue, the policy added trillions of dollars to the public debt. The policy did correlate with tangible growth. In the following 2 years, business investment rose, over 6 million workers received bonuses or wage hikes, and annual GDP growth reached 2.9%. Proponents of the tax cuts argue that the total economic impact cannot be judged in a 2-year window, as structural changes to the tax code often take a decade to reach their full effect. Critics point to data showing that while the economy grew, the benefits were largely concentrated among the top income earners, with negligible wage increases for the bottom 90% of the workforce. Ultimately, the audit shows that the tax cuts spurred expansion, but that growth was not nearly large enough to cover the cost of the cuts. The policy failed to self-finance, and the resulting gap was covered by borrowing. When we total the impact over 10 years, including interest, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act accounts for roughly $1.9 trillion in new debt. We can now log that first $1.9 trillion on our master ledger. Even with that massive figure accounted for, it only represents about 24% of the total debt increase seen during these 4 years. We have tracked the revenue we chose not to collect. Next, we have to look at the other side of the ledger, where the government actually spent the remaining trillions. In 2016, Donald Trump campaigned on a platform of strict fiscal conservatism. The promise was to eliminate government waste, shrink the federal footprint, and eventually balance the national budget. However, the federal government added $7.8 trillion to the national debt. Public debate often blames this entirely on tax cuts or the pandemic, but the data shows several distinct financial drivers. To understand this total, we must separate deliberate administrative policy choices from the massive emergency spending forced by a sudden global crisis. Examining this division shows exactly how the federal government's fiscal headroom changed during a period of economic growth and where that left the country when the pandemic arrived. The first major policy driver, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, added $2.5 trillion to the national debt. The second segment represents a significant expansion in government spending. Between 2018 and 2019, an additional $2.3 trillion was added. A primary target for this money was the military. The administration prioritized modernization, directing funds toward aircraft, shipbuilding, and weapons systems. By 2020, the defense budget had reached $733 billion, a 24% increase in just 3 years. These increases were locked in through the bipartisan budget acts of 2018 and 2019, requiring the administration to negotiate with Congress to raise spending limits. The deal relied on a bipartisan trade. Republicans secured their military modernization goals only because they agreed to equal increases in domestic spending programs for education, infrastructure, and veterans benefits. Other proactive spending choices included $28 billion in bailouts for American farmers, intended to compensate for losses caused by retaliatory tariffs during the trade war with China. By late 2019, $4.8 trillion in new debt was already on the books. This spending occurred during the period of economic growth, using up the country's financial reserves just months before a historic crisis. In March 2020, the global economy came to a sudden halt as a virtually unknown virus spread across the country. This chart shows the immediate impact on the workforce. Unemployment spiked from 3.5% to 14.7% in a single month. 22 million Americans lost their jobs, marking the fastest employment collapse in the nation's history. Returning to the total debt bar, the final segment shows the scale of the federal intervention. Across 5 separate relief bills, the government authorized $3.6 trillion in emergency spending. The largest component was the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. It provided $1,200 stimulus checks to adults and created the Paycheck Protection Program, which used forgivable loans to keep small business employees on payroll. The CARES Act passed the Senate 96-0. This rare unanimity was driven by warnings from economists that without a massive federal response, unemployment could have hit 30%. While no administration is responsible for a pandemic, the cost of preventing a total economic collapse placed an overwhelming burden on a federal budget that was already heavily leveraged. Identifying where the $7.8 trillion went is only the first step. We also have to look at the economic outcomes to see what that investment actually purchased. The emergency spending achieved critical goals. It prevented a second Great Depression, modernized the military, and funded the development of COVID-19 vaccines in just 11 months, a process that typically takes a decade. Other outcomes were more costly. The corporate tax cuts did not pay for themselves through growth, and the habit of using deficit spending during good economic years made the debt a permanent feature of the budget. There were also unintended consequences in the labor market. The $600 weekly unemployment bonus created a shortage of workers, as some employees earned more from the relief benefits than from their previous wages. The $7.8 trillion increase is the combined weight of 2 distinct eras: years of deliberate bipartisan spending during an economic expansion, followed by the most expensive emergency response in American history. It is a debt that remains long after the emergency has passed, leaving a balance sheet that now defines the nation's financial future. $7.8 trillion. That is the exact amount added to the United States national debt during Donald Trump's first 4 years in office. This chart shows exactly how that $7.8 trillion breaks down. We see $1.9 trillion resulting from tax cuts, and $2.3 trillion from spending increases, and $3.6 trillion allocated to the massive COVID emergency response. While the pandemic required rapid, massive intervention, the sheer volume of this spending established a staggering new baseline for what the federal government consumes. That momentum carried right over when Trump returned to the White House in January 2025. In just his first year back, watchdogs tracked an additional $2.25 trillion piled onto the ledger, driven heavily by tariff-related economic disruptions and new executive spending. This waterfall chart illustrates the math behind his signature July 2025 legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill. We start with a $4.5 trillion drop from lost revenue due to tax cuts. This is only partially offset by $1.4 trillion in spending cuts to programs like Medicaid and student loans. The result is a net cost of $3.4 trillion over a decade. However, looking at the projections from the Penn-Wharton budget model on this same chart, we see the opposite outcome. The economic drag from borrowing that much money is expected to decrease GDP by 0.3% and lower wages by 0.4%. Supporters argue these tax cuts will spur enough economic growth to pay for themselves. Measured, this tension between political optimism about growth and strict mathematical reality has defined American economic policy for the last 40 years. To understand how we arrived at this point, we have to audit the past 4 decades of presidential spending. Under Ronald Reagan, the Treasury added $1.7 trillion in debt, pioneering the modern approach of running deficits to fund large tax cuts. Bill Clinton is the only recent executive to reverse the trend, managing to run annual surpluses and briefly stall the debt's growth. George W. Bush added $6.1 trillion, driven heavily by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by the 2008 bank bailouts. Barack Obama oversaw an $8.6 trillion increase to fund the financial crisis stimulus and a major expansion of healthcare. Then we hit the recent explosive single-term spikes, $7.8 trillion added during Trump's first term, immediately followed by the largest single-term dollar increase in history, $8.5 trillion under Joe Biden. While the two major political parties engage in constant ideological warfare, they have collectively engineered a highly effective system for continuous deficit spending. Republicans consistently prioritize sweeping tax cuts and expanded military budgets, leaving gaps in the revenue stream. Democrats prioritize broad domestic programs and robust social spending, expanding the government's financial obligations. This scale visualization shows the mechanism they both rely on to avoid making politically dangerous choices. Rather than cutting favored programs or raising taxes on constituents, they simply borrow the difference to fund their priorities. The result is an entire political apparatus that has managed to avoid strict financial trade-offs for more than a quarter of a century. That initial $7.8 trillion from Trump is just a fraction of the towering $38.7 trillion in total accumulated American debt. And the structure is actively expanding, compounding by an additional $1.7 trillion every single year, regardless of who is president. The most pressing question for the next generation is not whether past presidents spent too much, they all did, but whether the United States is capable of living within its means. A liability of this size, compounding at this speed, cannot be ignored forever. Eventually, the math wins. Next week, we're investigating exactly who profits from this systemic deficit and who ultimately pays the bill. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments, do you think the $3.6 trillion in COVID spending was worth the cost? I read every single one. See you next week.
I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.